Good afternoon. We are Group 5. We have Brian, Zola, Anthony, and Stanley, and myself. We were given the topic of taking into account the diversity of the public of accessing rock art sites. Specific focus on the cave rock art sites that we have here in France. If we may go to the next slide. Yes, so there were various topics which we thought that we could address within public diversity. As you can see within the first slide, we are targeting age. This specifically refers to the young, but we also touched on the elderly. So if we can look, we can see what our observations were with regards to what we were able to, the various sites we were able to visit during this week. So part of our observations were that we took note that there are tour guides which specifically cater for children with the various interactive programs that they have available for the children. And based on the information that we received from Catherine, it is mentioned that it is strongly recommended to give tours for children from the ages of 7. However, this is not a restriction. And then with regards to the aspects to consider with age, it has to be with, we discussed it with our guide from Professor Amanda Esterhazen. What topics to actually consider was the possible effects of the environment on the children. Because we have to remember this is a cave, it's quite dark. How do children feel about it? I know adults themselves panic when they find themselves in a completely dark room. And now we have to consider this for children as well. Also, not just the dark, but also being in an enclosed space. Because once a child has a panic or like has a tantrum, they want out and they want out now. So how do you really address that? And then we said another aspect to consider is the age limit, whether there should be an age limit or how young can we go and how old can we also go. We also need to consider the elderly as well, because these are long walks and not all of them are on leveled ground, and we have to also consider that this is environments that can also be very humid, very cold sometimes, maybe also fluctuating levels of oxygen and specifically CO2. Another aspect to consider would be the height of the children and the visibility of the rock art. Now, we know that most of this rock art can be on walls, but most of them are also on the ceiling. And then we asked, okay, but children are quite short. What is their experience like? At the end of the day, rock art is rock art, and maybe the images appear bigger to them, but at what level, at what height? I don't know if this is something that people actually consider as well, but this is something we talked about and we thought maybe this is something we can consider as well, something to touch on. So the recommendations that we discussed, for one, is for guides to talk to the children and or the guardians, whether it's the teachers or their parents, to prepare them for the experience. Because as much as we want to immerse people in that dark environment and then brighten it up to let them have that experience, some people need a warning beforehand. And then we said also the introduction of an elevated step closer to the art for the children to get visibility. So as we took into consideration that most of these rock art sites, within the cave, the floors have already been adjusted. So if it is not too much of an obstruction, to then have a certain part of that floor leveled to a point for the children to then get an elevated view of the rock art, whereas the adults can still, from behind them, also view the rock art. So that is just a recommendation we discussed. Of course, taking into consideration the level of obstruction it may cause. The third recommendation was that to have tour guides to show panels better adapted to the age groups. So that was height related as well. Another thing, that I also wanted to put, that we wanted to put in there with an elevated step, this can then also double up as a sitting area for the elderly. So you are taking into consideration the young and the old. Before we move on, would my panelists like to add something onto age? We already discussed this, so just in case I missed something. Okay, we can move on. Next, disabilities. This is a very broad topic to discuss. We even had to choose which type of disabilities we would touch on. And at the end of the day, diversity, we also said, to what extent will you go when it comes to touching on diversity? So as you can see, the 4 points mentioned at the top, we are talking about impaired vision, physical disability, oh dear, that is actually supposed to be impaired hearing, and then neurodivergence, but specifically focusing on light sensitivity. Before I get more deep into that, just so that we are all on the same page, we also looked up the definition of disability, just so that we are all on the same page. Disability is an experience of any condition that makes it more difficult for a person to do certain activities or have equitable access within a given society. So that is what we are specifically focusing on when we are talking about the disabilities. With regards to the observations made, specifically to these 4 disabilities which we have identified. First, I need to see better. First, we made observations that at some sites they have Braille documents available as well as replicas which may be touched and felt. Then we also took note of the geographical locations of these cave sites. Of course, we discussed this. It's not like we are saying that these locations need to be moved, but it's just taking into account the areas they are found in, quite rural, quite mountainous, and therefore we need to look at the accessibility. Then we said, look, let me just see. Sorry. Bookings have to be made in advance to make arrangements for the disabled persons as well as for international visitors. So it's just that concept of you can't just show up, you have to make the bookings in advance, and sometimes visitors are unaware, especially the international visitors who just drop in. So it's always nice to have that information shared as well beforehand, but these were the observations that we took note of. Then certain sites, such as Peshmel, I don't know if I'm saying it correctly, they provide booklets in different languages for the various rock art points within the cave, and this is something that's very useful for the individuals which may suffer from impaired hearing, something that's not always available at all the other sites. But it's something we took note of, and it was actually very interesting and something that can be very helpful as well. So you can get an idea, because at Peshmel there were certain sites. As we moved along the cave, you had numbered sites. We moved from point 1 to the next point. You could see number 2 and then 3, and we moved along. And within the booklet, it goes along with each point that was numbered. So you can also follow along in case you can't hear what the guide is saying, then you can read about it. Then we took note of the railings, which were along the cave art. Now these railings double up as not just railings to assist for people to walk, but also assist them to keep that distance from the wall. So it doubles up as a conservation effort as well. And then restricted passageways was also an observation. Not all the cave have broad enough pathways for groups of people to walk. Sometimes you have to walk one by one, but at the end of the day, these are also natural features. So these are just things that we are taking into account. Anyways, moving on. Aspects to consider. Now, the first one we mentioned is flickering lights. Now, like I said, with light sensitivity, just something to take into consideration. All these new, especially the replicator sites, they have such amazing new technologies and ideas that they bring in, especially with the UV light, and then you can see the outlines so nicely. It's just the idea that sometimes, especially at Lascaux 4, those UV lights were actually quite flickering. And I don't know if for someone with light sensitivity, that can actually trigger a seizure. So just it's something to take note of. Another aspect to consider, do the other caves offer safety information to the visitors? Something, from our experience, it wasn't something that was done at every site. To get that full package of, please be aware of this and this might be an issue, so in case anybody may have these conditions, please do inform us, all those type of standards that you usually go through just to make sure. But at the end of the day, like I said, you have to have a list of what you should touch on, because you can't touch on everything that can be considered a diversity. Then the last aspect is, are there proper safety measures in place at the various caves? Now, what we mentioned here is people or children getting lost or left behind. We've had a few witnessed moments. We almost lost a member, if all of you are not aware, at Rufiniak. As we were leaving, the door was closed and one of our members were actually left behind, and she was knocking and she was calm, in a panicked mode, but calm, but she found her way out. It's just the idea of getting to make sure that there are those measures in place to make sure everyone did get out before the lights go out, especially if you consider children, especially in a cave where there are lots of tunnels and pathways. So these are things we have to also just keep in mind. With regards to the recommendations, okay, we tried to make a recommendation for each disability, just so that we can touch on it broadly. So the first one was considering building replicas of some original sites. This is for the physically disabled, because we are aware that not all the sites are physically accessible. They're in mountains, they're in caves, it's very narrow. So perhaps the recommendation for a replica, and we know France are experts at creating precise replicas. So that was one of the recommendations. The second would be virtual tours at all sites, also for the physically disabled. I will explain more about the virtual tours and the recommendation thereof on the next slide, because it's a topic of its own. It really is. It's something new, it's something broad. But just to get an idea, it's something that allows anyone to get access to it. The third recommendation is that all sites should consider the incorporation of information booklets in different languages for the various rock art points within the cave, and this is for the impaired hearing. This is specifically making reference to the case of Peshmel, where I mentioned of all the stops, and then getting all the information so that those with the impaired hearing can also follow along. Then consider incorporation of Braille documents, replicas, and narrations for all the sites, and that's specifically for the visually impaired. We understand that, unfortunately, blind people cannot experience the cave as any average person can. Now, the thing about the replicas and even the narrations, even with the virtual tours, the narration itself can already give somewhat of a story, somewhat of a feel, so they can also experience it as is. So it's something to consider. And then lastly, tour guides to give standard safety information to the visitors before the tour, and then warning as well of the UV lights for light sensitivity as well.
Maybe to add on that, tour guides should also make sure that everyone is out of the cave before they close the doors, to avoid such like what happened in the compound.
Yes. Yes, moving on. Cultures, next, diversity. This is another broad topic, so the only thing we touched on with different cultures was languages. We are talking about prehistoric sites, so we are not going to look at religious diversity or ethnic diversity. It's what we agreed on is kind of irrelevant in this topic right now, so we are looking at language diversity. That's it. So with regards to the observations, we said that we noticed that the sites do cater for the typical European languages. We know French, Spanish, German, Portuguese, and English. And that some sites, like Lascaux 4, they provide at least one English tour every day, something that's not offered at all the sites. And then other sites like Rufiniak, they provide tours mainly in French, however with an additional fee for tours to be done in English with the headset. These are just observations we made, and we understand when it comes to language diversity, you cannot incorporate every language there is around the world. So we're trying to be realistic about this, which is also why when we also asked our questions, we also tried to understand what the statistics look like for visitors coming from the Southern Hemisphere. And they do get visitors from the Southern Hemisphere, this being Southern America, Southern Africa, and Australia. However, the one thing to take into consideration is the language that is shared with the countries from these areas, and that is English. So this is what we now focused on. Therefore, recommendation to consider the incorporation of English tours as a ready-made option for all the sites. This now also jumps over the bookings that have to be made beforehand if you are an international tour and you would need it in English. So if it's already a ready-made option, then there's that inclusion. Yes, next slide. Overall recommendation, and yes, so overall recommendations at the end after taking all of this into consideration. VR, virtual reality, like I said, I would touch on it. This is now me touching on it. Observation is that some sites have it and some sites don't, but it's also a matter of you have to ask if you would like to know whether it's available or not. And aspects to consider, as much as we said we recommend that all sites included, we know you have to consider funding, you have to consider the facilities, whether they are available, you have to consider accessibility and authenticity. With regards to accessibility, it just refers to the site. Is it a site that is easily accessible? If it's accessible, virtual tours is not necessarily a priority. If it's a site that's not easily accessible, we understand why a virtual tour might be recommended. Authenticity is another big topic, because at the end of the day, if you have more virtual tours than you have of the original, which one is authentic and which one is not? And we need to also get a line drawn between the two. And yes, so the recommendation for the VR, we as a group said that it is something we would recommend for all the sites. Reason being, if it is included, you, as an individual, you can get a closer view of the paintings, which may be difficult to view, and it causes absolutely no disturbance to the actual rock art. And then it's also a conservation method. Then you know that the real rock art is not being bothered by the number of visitors that may come to the site. We know we've discussed the humidity and the CO2 and the temperature. So then we know that it's also a conservation method, so that the people can rather make use of the virtual tour rather than visiting the actual site. And the main reason would be it can act as a digital database. If this digital database is in place, then it will allow to ensure the comparisons to be made. And this is for long-term and short-term monitoring. Because yesterday when we went to the monitoring for LASCO, yes, we took note of all the monitoring which has been done. So if you have a digital database in place for all the sites, you can already have that monitoring taking place as you move along. And then lastly, it's not necessary, well, okay, we recommended that the virtual tour should not necessarily be part of the main tour. Who would want to see the tour when you've already seen the real thing, or see the real thing after you've seen the virtual tour? So let people have the option, and then it's something that definitely should not be free. All the time and effort and money that went to it, we should, if you want quality, you must pay for quality. That's what we recommended. Okay, yes. Final overall recommendations continued. The extent of diversity inclusion. So just to touch on everything again, age. We said physical changes to the site for better visitor, in other words, children experience. So, for example, the adjustment we recommended for the elevator step for the children, to what extent, if this is incorporated, is it obstructing, is it damaging or changing the site itself to now incorporate the visitor experience of the children? If it is, like we mentioned, if it is something that can be incorporated without increasing the damage, it's something to consider. If it will damage the site's integrity, then it's something which will not be recommended at all. So it really has to do with the context. The same with the disability, exact same limit of the physical changes to the site for better visitor experience is something that needs to be considered, because at the end of the day, authenticity. The site itself, most of these sites have already undergone so many changes throughout the years before considering the authenticity of the site to better accommodate visitor experience. So at the end of the day, which one is prioritized? As heritage consultants, as we all are, I'm sure we prioritize authenticity of a visitor experience. So it's something that really needs to be considered. Language, we said, yes, we have to be realistic. You can't incorporate all the languages in the world. But in our case, we recommended to better accommodate the countries from the Southern Hemisphere to please incorporate English as a ready-made option. And then overall, all the recommendations that we have given are to be taken and made within reason. So not as is, it all depends on the context. And I think that is it from Group 5. If you would like to say anything else, please. We have time for questions.
Thank you, Group 5, for a very interesting presentation. Mine is not a question, it's an observation when you talked about accessibility, the kids and all that. Maybe it's just a personal observation, but I wanted to talk about the entrance to most of these caves. I personally felt intimidated, like the heavy metal doors there, right? Like it's not enticing for a visitor. Like I come through, then they open that heavy metal door, you go inside, it's dark, then you're told you can't take any photos. I don't know how, but I feel they have to develop some infrastructure that is enticing, like you feel comfortable to get inside that cave. I just wanted to comment on the entrance, the access, the metal doors, like as if maybe there is some valuables inside that. Is it security or what? It's not comfortable for a visitor like myself. That's my comment.
Okay.
Thank you for your comment. I would like to make a comment on your comment. No, I understand what you mean. Every person has their experience when they come to a site. I'm sure we all have also taken into consideration the different ways that different countries actually manage their sites. And from what I have seen, this is not also just my personal comment, to what extent do we change the sites to accommodate visitor experience, like I mentioned? Because at the end of the day, those metal doors serve a purpose. It's to enclose the site, it's to make sure that the environment is stable within. Because at a point, the entrance was also man-made, it was created for visitor entrance, and with time they realized this actually it has a more negative impact than it did with regards to the visitor experience that they were trying to provide. So if you have maybe another suggestion, if not a metal door, maybe a wooden door. But I mean, that's just my take on why they keep it closed. So yes, just my comment. Would you like to also? Okay.
Okay. For me, something I've thought of with regards to different languages is, you know how when you go to a restaurant and then sometimes you can scan a QR code for the menu. I thought that would be a really good idea as a way of having a lot more languages. So if you scanned a QR code, it would pop up, like in different locations would be different QR codes, and then it would pop up with the language that you can choose from and maybe a paragraph of the explanation of what you're looking at. However, the only thing with this thought is that you'd probably need internet connection and a phone that could scan the QR code. But yeah, it's just something I've always thought about it as a way that you could do it, because essentially that QR code would pop up a website that can be, you know, protected and managed by the owner and the management. And yeah, could essentially just copy and paste a translation into Google Translate and have a lot of different ones that you could just select from. But that is the thing, is internet connection. You can't really have Wi-Fi within caves to scan all these codes. But maybe museums, if there's free Wi-Fi, then you could probably, but yeah, that's also a thing, is if there's free Wi-Fi to do it, or you just use your data. But yeah, that is something I've thought of.
You can actually package it in the app.
Can you?
If you get people to download the app before they start, you can package all of that.
Yeah.
And then it just operates from the cell phone. But I think the problem would be
So thank you very much for that. You focused very much on the physical access, but access can take into account lots of different, things like emotional access and learning access and all those kinds of things. So I was wondering, one, if you considered that, and secondly, what was strange to me going through these sites was that there were no learning aids as we went through. So I was thinking, instead of the big reveal, turning on the light, whether with some of them, they wouldn't be useful if they handed out a sheet with the drawings of some of the images, maybe not for every single hall or that we went into, and then engage with those drawings while looking at the scene in front of you. That might have enhanced some of the access that people had to the imagery. I don't know if it's something that you were thinking about, that kind of access as well, because access can take into account lots of different activities and experiences and so on.
If I know that we did discuss it a bit. I think we just also forgot to include it in the presentation as well when it comes to the information that is also prepared for different groups, whether they are for students or for the average tourist or even for professionals, so that we can also establish that difference as well, because information is taken in differently as well. But with regards to the learning aids, I don't think we touched on that. Would you guys want to add on to that? Okay.
Another question?
Yep.
Yeah.
I'm going to answer for you. When I passed, I heard you talking about a tablet, so it may be related to what is talking about. But that's not my comment. My comment is, okay, you gave all these comments on France. How would it look when we flip it to Southern Africa? How would we implement this on the other side of the town?
May I? Thank you for your question. Honestly, as you said, we looked at France when we did this presentation as well, so it's very context related. So if you want to apply this to our own countries, we'll have to re-look at everything with each aspect, because it's different. How should I put it? Every concept we touched on is very specific to the country itself, like the age groups, like the accessibility. Cave rock art, and compared to the rock art we have, our open air sites that we have in Southern Africa, it's very different. So we'll have to really look at it differently as well. Language, as of yet, from what I am aware of, we all stick to the current official global language, which is English. So yes, that is from my experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry?
In Southern Africa.
Southern Africa. Yeah.
Yeah.
Also use vernacular language. There's vernacular language, there's English language.
Yes, I'm sure.
But mainly English is the main.
English is the
main language.
I'm sure in every country they make use of the vernacular languages which are available, but the main language which is spoken especially to the international visitors is English.
To add on most of our sites,
Just a comment on the age limit when we are comparing with our sites in Zimbabwe. Most of our rock art paintings start from the ground, going up. So the kids can access, they can see the paintings. Unfortunately for the disabled, the physically challenged, they are up there in the hill. maybe you could have touched on that one. How best can we make them to access those sites?
Like what she said, we're only focusing on the sites here in France. But for us, I mean, for ROCAT in Southern Africa, the issue of accessibility is just a challenge everywhere, because most of the ROCAT sites are located deep into the bush and up the mountain. And the issue of funding to create such condition for the disabled people to get up there is something else.
But then again, which is also why we recommend virtual tours is the future.
I'm just going to respond to that.
Okay. Yeah, I was just going to say that sometimes we package languages, German, French, the main languages, but it's in audio, you know, and numbered. That's in museum.
But the other thing to mention, there are sometimes sites which are reasonably close to the road. You know, even in the Ukaklaba Drakensberg, I'm sure in the Matosi, you said most of the sites are in the hills. Most of the sites. Most of the sites. So I'm sure if you think hard enough, probably with sort of limited adjustments, you could probably get people to one or two sites. Lower down, closer to the road, and then create an experience for people who are either in wheelchairs or have limited mobility. It's just a matter of saying, look, this is a priority, and now how are we going to do this?
Or they can come to the museum.
Okay. Just a comment. I would like to add that maybe a visit is not enough for some people, for the kids, and maybe for the person who have a disability. And so there is things that we had, for example, for children, there is a workshop. We let them make painting on wall, and that's something can be done. But each time it's to build for the specificity of the public. Maybe visiting the site is not enough.
The next group, Melanie?
Yes, thank you so much, group number 5.